Hello again, this is Lomi, back with part 2 of this modification project. Today we're tackling the additive half of the mod. I begin with some epoxy sculpt, which is a 2-part epoxy clay. Just mix equal amounts of both parts until it's blended, and then I can get to work. You may notice that the container says white. It's actually kind of a greenish gray, so if you need white pieces, you'd still have to paint these. The color doesn't matter here, since this will be airbrushed for a skin tone match, but it's still worth mentioning. There are epoxies that are actually white. This just isn't one of them. I'm going to begin the additions with putting in a rounded shape to represent her tongue. Everyone works differently with different materials, but I find I work best by using a lot more clay than I need and then slowly removing it to get the shape I want. Other people may find that adding smaller amounts and building up works better for them. For all of this sculpting, I'm using dental cleaning tools. There's a metal pick and a scraper, a plastic scraper that's a bit more flexible, and the red rubber dental stimulator, which is the best tool I've ever found for smoothing things out. The epoxy clay is very responsive to water, and the water doesn't inhibit the cure. I dip the rubber stimulator into water before using it to smooth the clay. Once the tongue is shaped, it's time to add the teeth. I roll a piece of epoxy between my fingers, and well, this is going to be a problem. Epoxy does eventually expire, and as it starts aging, it starts to lose its stickiness. This is the same epoxy I used to complete the modifications on Rune, so I think it's at the end of its life. I use the dental tools to score the ridge where I'm trying to place the teeth, but it doesn't add enough texture to make up for the lack of stickiness. I'll try something else. This is another 2-part epoxy. This one is from Tamiya. It's available at most hobby stores in small packages. It's a little bit newer than the epoxy sculpt, so maybe it'll work better. I mix a piece and get back to work. It seems to be sticking a little better. Whoops, too hard. That knocked it right off. Let's try again. Using a light hand is important for fine detail work. While the Tamiya epoxy sticks better, it's also a much firmer clay than the epoxy sculpt, so it doesn't want to take an even shape. I smooth it out as well as I can before adding pieces to be the little fangs. Since the space I have to work with is very small and the clay is being difficult, I decide to attach little bumps that are larger than what I need. After they cure, I'll be able to file them down to points. The epoxy sticks to itself better than it sticks to the resin. I move them around until I'm happy with the placement. At this point, the shape is still really rough, but I have to let the epoxy cure before I can do anything else. It takes a full 24 hours for every addition to cure. After it's cured, I start carving the fangs to points with a knife. Then I sand the teeth and tongue with 320 grit sandpaper, and use a needle file to continue shaping and smoothing. The dental tools are good for evening out the edges and removing excess, as well as smoothing the surface, even after it's cured. Even after sanding, there are some ridges in the teeth that I'm just not satisfied with, so I try smoothing them out with the addition of a little bit of Bondo putty. Make sure you open a window if you're using this stuff indoors, even if you're wearing a respirator. It's pretty potent. It also dries really fast, so only squeeze out as much as you can use within a few seconds. I use my tools to both press the putty into the places I really need it and to clean up the excess from where it doesn't need to be. After another 24-hour cure, I sand off the excess putty. I'm still not happy with how it's looking. It's not as smooth as it should be. There are still a lot of ridges and pinholes that weren't filled by the Bondo. So I finally suck it up and go buy a new package of epoxy clay, so it'll be extra fresh, super soft, and very sticky. This time I'm using white milliput, which actually is white after mixing. Oops, that's way too much. I try to pick up small pieces of clay and work it into the bumps and ridges. It takes a little effort to get it to go where I want, since this is solid clay and not a thin putty. So it's a slow process, a little at a time. It probably would have saved me a lot of work to go buy new epoxy at the beginning of the project instead of assuming what I had was still fresh enough to do a good job. If stored correctly, epoxies can last several years, but the area I live in has high summer heat and high humidity, which shortens the lifespan of a lot of materials. "24 hours later, the teeth are finally looking pretty good. Now it's time to recreate a lower lip. I put on a big chunk of clay, then start carving away the excess. The new epoxy is so sticky I need something to wipe it on to get it off my tools. I try to keep the corners of the mouth clear and work on shaping and blending a little at a time. There's not much to say about the sculpting process for this. It's just a matter of slowly nudging the clay around until I have a good base shape. It will need multiple layers of clay to build it up, because especially thick layers can sag when the clay is so soft. So I actually break this work up over several days. Once everything is as close to the right shape as I can get it, I dip my finger in water and smooth it over the modifications. This is a small thing that will blend all the uncured clay and make a big difference for sanding. After that's completely cured, I start wet sanding. Wet sanding usually gives a much smoother result, and it also keeps the dust from getting in the way. I use sandpaper not only to smooth out the modifications, but to refine the shape a little at a time. When the shape starts looking good, I switch from 320 grit sandpaper to 600 grit, which will give a nice, smooth surface, indistinguishable from the resin. Oh no, one of her fangs broke. That's one problem I have noticed with the Tamiya epoxy. It's sometimes more brittle than the other options. That's not a problem for reshaping large things, but for tiny things like these teeth, it's hit and miss. It should be pretty easy to repair now that I have the newer epoxy though. I go ahead and finish the sanding and filing of the rest of the teeth and the lower lip. Then I use just a tiny bit of milliput and remake the broken tooth. The other tooth was reinforced with milliput when I filled in around it, so it's sturdy enough I won't have to worry about it. Once it's cured, it's time to finish the lip with putty. This fills in all the tiny pinholes left behind by air bubbles in the epoxy, or scratches left by the sandpaper, or even ridges where the epoxy didn't join smoothly with the resin. There's a small scuff on her upper lip I fix with it too. One more day to cure the putty, then it's time for a final sanding. This removes most of the putty, leaving it only where it's necessary for a smooth finish. And there we go. If the doll's owner is happy with the changes, the next step will be airbrushing the modifications to match the resin, then doing her face up. Otherwise, we'll come back and make as many changes as requested until she's happy with the final result. It's a pretty different look, but I think it'll be really interesting to see her in the end. And that's all for today. Thanks for watching. Bye.